Dietrich, is it? Hello, good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for those kind words, Dietrich, and to welcome you all here today to the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. And the theme is an environmentally sustainable healthcare debate. We have three speakers, Claire, Carmen and Ian on the top table here. And just to say at the outset, you referenced the government formation in Ireland. Just to be clear, it's a centre, I'd say centrist. My party is a centrist party, so it's probably centre-right. So it would be very much free marketeer, liberal and social outlook, but also importantly from the point of view of business. Certainly would be very pro-business, pro-enterprise, very supportive of the tax regime that's in Ireland, and more importantly, and critically, an issue that's going to be very relevant for what we're talking about here today in the context of new dialogue that will be required in the transatlantic space with the new presidency in the White House. That will be a key significant challenge for us in Ireland, in Europe, and globally as well, to see, can we arrive at a space that is comfortable for European companies, American companies to work together in a collaborative way rather than a confrontational way. And that has to be done at a level above that in the political space. So it clearly is critically important over the next number of months that the European Commission, the Commissioner for Trade and the national governments across Europe engage in a proactive way with the incoming presidency. A confrontational way will not benefit anybody. That would be my interpretation of it. So it is something that I feel we have to start working very, very quickly. So rather than I speaking for the morning, because I know that we can have a broader discussion later on, I must get my itinerary to the first discussion. And just to say that GSK are a company that's also sponsoring this event this morning, and being parochial as all politicians are, GSK is located in Ireland, but it's also located in a village or a town very near me in Carrigtwohill. It's quite a cutting-edge facility in Carrigtwohill, and it's really dynamic in the research development area in vaccines, immunology, and HIV, respiratory, and oncology as well. So it really is a dynamic space, and Ireland in itself, in terms of the pharmaceutical sector, is in a dynamic space. But beyond that, of course, we have to ensure that the pharmaceutical sector plays its part in the green transition, in the digital economy, and in the green economy as well. And with that in mind, I suppose, firstly, I will turn to you, Claire, and just say, where do we go in terms of looking at what we need to do in the pharmaceutical sector to make it comply with the very ambitious goals of carbon neutrality by 2050? And particularly in view of the fact that it is a global industry. It's very long supply chains, logistical supply chains, both downstream and upstream of manufacturing facilities. So where do you see the key areas where there is potential for the industry in general to move towards carbon neutrality by 2050?
Thank you. Is this? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And first of all, let me just say, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to everybody. Thank you to the Oldie Party for joining us on this event. It is an important and timely topic, and I will go into the details of that in a second, but you've done the introduction to GSK, so I don't feel I need to do that. But I will introduce our goals and commitments, because actually it does set the framing for the question. So back in 2020, we actually set ambitious targets as a company to not only be net zero, but also to be nature positive for a healthier planet. And actually, we're one of the first companies to have our nature targets validated by the Science Based Targets for Nature. And on our net zero commitment, we actually put out a bold statement to have an 80% reduction across all scopes by 2030. So these are pretty bold, ambitious targets as an organization, and that's from discovery of medicines all the way through to disposal of medicine, so taking full end-to-end account and responsibility. But we can't do that alone. And we also recognize that to really transition sustainable healthcare systems and global economic systems around health and having a healthy planet for healthy people, we have to do that within policy frameworks, working with industry, working with healthcare patients. It is a collective effort to really drive that sustainability agenda. And there's a couple of things I'll say in terms of how to do that. One, obviously innovation is critical. We need new medicines, new processes, new techniques, new technologies to really help drive towards that. And we need the policy framework to really support and incentivize that as well. We also need actually good regulation and regulatory support to drive those actions, whether that's through energy efficiency. 5% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the healthcare sector. We don't really want that to increase, which it will do as we go forwards without a prevention-led approach to sustainable healthcare and medicines. So how can we really work on energy efficiency, greening buildings? So again, we do that through various routes in collaboration, and I can go into details as we get into it. But we do need that regulatory framework to really help accelerate some of those activities and incentivize sustainable medicines and support in that space as well. There's lots of challenges. I'm sure we'll go into that in a second, but I'll pause and let others speak as well.
Thank you very much. Ian Marnane, Head of Unit of Pollution and Health in the European Environment Agency. You might just give us some overviews first of where you see the challenges and opportunities.
Yeah, thanks, Billy. Well, I think for me, from our perspective, first of all, the European Environment Agency, we're not a regulator, but we're a knowledge provider, and we generate a lot of information and knowledge that helps to inform policy. So that's the perspective that we're coming from. But I think one of the things that I would say here is that sustainability is much broader as well than decarbonizing. And the healthcare sector certainly has a big role to play there, for example, in terms of addressing issues around antimicrobial resistance, for example, or safe and sustainable use of chemicals. And I think from our perspective, more broadly, the healthcare sector also can be a very strong advocate for the benefits of a clean and healthy environment in terms of reducing the overall health care burden in Europe. So, for example, we know that environmental pollution causes around 10% of premature deaths in Europe. And we also know that the burden of living with these diseases like diabetes or respiratory diseases or cardiovascular diseases that are related to environmental pollution are also quite significant. So again, by reducing pollution, for example, we can also reduce the impacts of climate change. We can reduce the burden on the healthcare system and have, again, increase sustainability from that perspective. So I think that's the preventive element is really one of the roles that we would be highlighting, and also the role that the environment has to play, and importantly, the role that the healthcare sector has to play in promoting a clean and healthy environment as well, because I don't think you can have one without the other.
Thank you very much, Ian. And we have Carmen Laplaza Santos, Head of Unit of Health Innovations and Ecosystems from the European Commission. Over to you, Carmen.
Thank you, and good morning to everybody, and thanks for having organized this very important this panel on this very important theme. From the perspective of the European Commission, this is going to be 5 years where sustainable competitiveness is going to be the main two keywords, right? Competitiveness, but sustainable, and this is coming from many calls for that, but in particular, let me just phrase what Draghi is asking us: transformation from Europe, so decarbonizing while at the same time keeping competitive. And I fully agree with what was said by my two predecessors speakers. It's more than decarbonization, and certainly I think that the healthcare sector has an important role to play. From our activities in my unit, we have devoted a lot of efforts in the last 2-3 years in order to push the greening of the healthcare sector from a research and innovation perspective, from all angles, from the angles of the industry. So we are pushing through our work with the pharmaceutical industry and med tech and the different sectors of the health industry, with whom we are collaborating in the context of the Innovative Health Initiative. We are also doing through Cluster 1 Health, so funding research and innovation in order to facilitate the work from the healthcare providers, but also from the healthcare industry. So we see only opportunities, but I think one important aspect is indeed prevention, and I will come back to that in the future, because we can, in the next minutes, because we can develop a lot of technologies, but we need to ensure that those who need to uptake those technologies will be able to do so. So the demand side, and in this case, the healthcare systems are very important in this equation.
Thank you very much, Carmen. Just we'll go to questions and answers, obviously, later on in the discussion. Because we are in a new dispensation, and the European Union sometimes, and even the Draghi report, as referenced by Carmen, does highlight the the challenges, but equally, I suppose, the potential in terms of decarbonisation, chasing that Green Deal, and also ensuring that we remain competitive, or that we use the Green Deal and decarbonisation as an opportunity to enhance competitiveness. And that's the way we have to look at it. But obviously, if you do have large economies or other areas of the world that are unwinding from international agreements, it does put a significant challenge in front of us immediately around how we have a level playing pitch globally, but and then retain our competitiveness. So I suppose a question to all the panelists here is, where do you see Europe in terms of being an attractive place competitively for inward investment, for research and for development, for promoting sustainability and achieving or maintaining our competitiveness, both as an entity, but also in your industry itself, particularly in view of a lot of competitors, particularly the States, but Asia as well now very much so, not necessarily as attached to the international deals like the Paris Agreement and others in the areas of sustainability. So maybe
Sorry. Sharing a mic here. I get asked this question strangely a lot at the moment. And in fact, one of the responses is, as a company and frankly, as an industry, we are holding firm on the commitments we've made on sustainability, primarily because it's also just good business. So you can't make medicines and vaccines without water. So we need to have a resilient and secure water supply. And actually, you need a healthy environment for healthy patients. So actually, the logic around the impact of climate change, nature loss on patients is pretty much understood by, I think, healthcare professionals and doctors and nurses. So it is actually still driving to the core of your organization's business, which is preventing disease. So actually, that's not changing. So to be very clear, we're looking at really how can we actually stay the course, continue to deliver. But I think where there's an opportunity for Europe is potentially to lead, to support that innovation of change, to really accelerate where it makes sense. So prevention, you've mentioned, Carmen, I fully support, and you, Ian. Prevention is actually sensible. It stops people going to hospitals in the first place. So there is a sustainable healthcare impact there. There's a cost impact. There's an environment benefit there as well. So really doubling down on prevention-led, patient-centric healthcare, I think, is a real opportunity for Europe to lead. I think there's an opportunity to make sure you unblock some of the regulatory conflicting challenges. And I can give a tangible example at the moment. We've actually tried to reduce plastic in packaging and actually remove 400 tons of plastic from vaccines providers. But we've actually just been told by the medical regulator we have to increase the size of the pack and therefore put them back in. So there's an interesting challenge, I think, around working with medical regulators, environmental policy and healthcare providers to really unlock the three together rather than having one counterbalancing the other. So again, I think there's an opportunity for Europe to really drive that alignment, consistency through regulatory support and approvals. So a couple of examples there, but I welcome the panel's discussion.
Yeah, great, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you definitely, as I said already, in relation to the preventive element. I think one thing is that, you know, over the coming years that we're going to see increasing pressure on the healthcare system, for example, from the impacts of climate change. So, for example, we know already that around half of healthcare facilities are in areas that are going to be particularly impacted by extreme heat events in cities. We know that 10% of healthcare facilities or more are in flood risk areas. So again, it's important to increase the resilience so that they're ready to actually respond to these threats when they happen as well. I think also from, we also know that if we can't continue to use natural resources at the rate that we're using them at the moment in terms of, for example, bringing sustainability to the supply chain. So I think in terms of the way that we power the healthcare sector in terms of transport or other production and consumption areas. So I think it's important that if we continue to see the same rates of biodiversity loss, if we continue to increase pollution, then there's no way we're going to actually achieve sustainability. So I think what we need to do in Europe is actually demonstrate the value of moving in that direction and the benefits that it has more broadly for health and well-being. For example, in terms of if we can develop more or bring about more resilience in people, for example, because we know if we have healthier people, if we reduce pollution, we have less of these health issues. and people are better able to deal with the impacts of climate change as well, for example, in terms of heat exposure or response to vector-borne diseases, for example, because we're going to see more of that in the future. So I think all of these things will coming together will show that, as I said already, that if we want to be sustainable, then that will in itself lead to better health outcomes as well.
And thanks, Ian. Carmen, I suppose there's sometimes criticisms of the European Union, and of course we will always say the Commission as well, as part of the European Union, around the issue of regulations not always being. What's going on, is it? Yeah. Is that better? Oh, that's much better. I was wondering why nobody was listening to me. Just in terms of the whole issue around compatibility of regulations with each other. Sometimes reference was made there about the plastics directive, for example, obligating you to do one thing, and yet we'll say some other health and safety regulation obligating you to do the exact opposite. Do you sense that there is a need to ensure that when regulations are either being reviewed or implemented in the first place, that there's more of a detailed analysis of the potential impacts that they have on each other? Because sometimes there's a criticism that we don't do enough horizontal impact assessments and regulatory impact assessments on what comes from the Commission to the Council and the Parliament. It's just an observation as opposed to direct criticism, of course.
Of course, no. I mean, of course, the regulations are proposed by the European Commission, but are very much discussed with other actors. So I would like to keep that in mind, that what comes out ultimately is not often what was originally proposed by the Commission. But nevertheless, your point is absolutely right. And I think this is very well in the heads of all those who are now currently thinking about all the regulations we are expected to be reviewing or proposing in the coming months. It's going to be extremely hectic. So, but I think this is a message that has been, it's extremely important, and it's not only about sustainability. It applies to medical devices and to clinical trials regulation, and we could be talking hours and hours. But I would like to come back to your original question on the competitiveness of Europe, because for us that's the key word, as I was going to say. And in the particular field of sustainability, I think that there are a lot of opportunities. There are many kind of green techs now. Green tech, there's going to be this Clean Tech Act, and there are lots of many research and innovations already ongoing in order to facilitate the circularity also of the healthcare sector. For example, there are many techniques now new, like the mechanochemistry. We have some projects working on that which are quite promising, but are still far from being uptaken by the whole industry. And for that, one thing that is absolutely critical is to ensure that constant dialogue, and quite early, with regulators. Because one of the things where we need to really improve is to ensure that by the day the technologies that we are investing on will be really there to be uptaken by the industry. Regulators are ready to approve them. That's something where we really need to decrease the timeline. So we need absolutely a dialogue between regulators and innovators in order to be ready to, to have not only sandboxes for safe and sustainable design and all these kind of things, but also really the knowledge that is needed in order to, to understand all this new world. So it's not, green tech is going to be complicated for health regulators, but we need to get there. As regards the opportunities, prevention is clearly very important, but I would like to call the industry also to look also at the consumption from the healthcare sector. We need to be aware that there is 20% of waste. This means that 20% of the healthcare spending is like going to the trash bin. It's inappropriate. It's even created further problems, adverse drug reactions, and whatsoever. So there are many opportunities there, because the best way to contribute to the planet is to reduce unnecessary consumption. This applies to every kind of sector, but also to health. So I know maybe this is not the first thing we think of when we talk about the green of the healthcare sector, but I think it's extremely important. 20% of inappropriate spending is too much. And that would open the opportunity also to uptake innovations the day they will be there. So I would really like that,
Yeah, Ian.
There was just what is this? I don't know. Is this working? Yeah. Yeah, just one thing I wanted to mention, which I think can sort of encourage a move towards this sustainability, is the approach at a national level to procurement. Because I think if we have initiatives at a national level that are put additional emphasis and weight on procuring green goods and services within that healthcare supply chain, then I think that will obviously incentivize a move in that direction as well. So I think, and a lot of these measures are needed at a national level. Obviously, Europe can do a certain amount, but nationally is where the impact is going to be made as well. So I think procurement is something that's really important from that perspective.
Thanks very much, Ian. I was waiting for the word reimbursement and procurement to be discussed. It's always discussed when you talk about pharmaceuticals companies, pharmaceutical strategy, and I suppose with that in mind, we talk about the need for the industry to continually improve and innovate. And if you look at Europe vis-a-vis other major trading blocks, certainly we're significantly challenged in the area of innovation and technology, in the sense of the amount of investment that goes into it. And if you look at the figures spent in the US over the last 25 years to Europe, we are falling way behind. That was clearly identified in Draghi report. The Draghi report is mandatory reading for everybody. It's easily downloaded and printed. I'd advise you to print it in color, because the charts are very, very detailed. So it's definitely worth reading. So I'd advise it. But from the point of view of Draghi, it does really identify a significant challenge in Europe around the issue of innovation research, clinical trials, for example, and whether or not Europe has to change fundamentally that attractiveness. And I suppose it goes back to the other discussion then around the pharmaceutical strategy, around intellectual property rights, for example, and protection of same, and also back to reimbursement and availability of medicines. So I mean, you could have a very strong intellectual property protection, but then equally the citizens have an entitlement for medicines to be available as well. And the idea that if you're born in a poorer country in the European Union, you've less entitlement to medicine, in my view, is an anathema to this concept of European citizenship. So, I mean, how would you square that circle around, from the pharmaceutical sector's point of view, around the issue of protection, and at the same time, the need to ensure that we have availability of medicines and a proper reimbursement or procurement and reimbursement scheme?
I knew that question was coming my way.
We'll blame Ian first for mentioning it. Okay.
I mean, I think, look, there's a couple of things in this topic. One, I'm not going to discuss the pharma ledger because that's in progress now. There's a couple of things in that which I hugely support: transition to e-leaflets, the voucher scheme for antimicrobial resistance. So there's massive opportunities in there. But you rightfully call out protection for innovation, because we've said we need innovation for novel medicines, novel processes, and frankly, faster transition to a green, sustainable healthcare. The use of enzymes can radically reduce resources being used, 6-fold increase. But we then have to go through, rightfully so, safe and effective clinical trials, which can take 5 to 8+ years. So I think there is an unblocker with innovation about how we can look at acceleration and protection. Then we talk about access, and just to be very clear, access is incredibly important to GSK in particular. We've topped the Access to Medicines Index for 8 years in a row and came second this year. So it's an incredibly important topic. But I think there is an opportunity to look at appropriate reimbursement of medicines for innovation, prevention, and how that narrative fits into what benefit is prevention doing to health budgets, sustainability of healthcare systems as well. So broadening it from just looking at a direct reimbursement model of a sort of a like for like, but how does that broaden the economic benefits across prevention and sustainability as well? The other piece I would say is, and I think Ian mentioned it, incentivization. We, and I'm sure many people get asked for tender responses. They're often all different at different national levels, and we're not entirely sure if it's making any difference to have sustainable products or sustainable medicines and vaccines. So I think there is a need to look at where some of those incentivizations come in as well. So on innovation, it is absolutely around making sure that protection is there to really drive change, but accelerate it as well. then I think there's a look to squaring that circle with reimbursement and prevention narrative and broadening that to a broader economic principle as well. So there's a lot in there, but it looks like Carmen's going to jump in. Sorry.
Thanks very much. Carmen?
Yeah, not exactly on that, even though it's very important. And HTA, for example, it's and it's not only about economic; it's also about all kind of many things that are not measured, but that important for the society. So no, I wanted to bring another point, which is the reason why we should continue investing in green is because another big problem for Europe now is from the perspective of availability is the critical medicines. So I think that also their research and innovation can play an important role. Now we are looking at it from the perspective of the urgency, right? But the main issue here is also the dependence from third countries. And we know that that's one of the objectives. We need to reduce that as much as possible. We need to find other sources, other APIs. There is a lot of innovation going there. There is the problem of the generics compared to the innovative medicines, but we cannot. I think that when we look at this problem, we cannot just look at it from the pure green and sustainability issue. It's just that investing on this is going to facilitate reaching other objectives that are equally important for our society as well. So I think that maybe, and that is maybe related to what you were saying about the fact that it's very difficult to look just from a regulatory perspective to one single objective without looking at all the others. And in some case, the opportunity appears. So it's not always ones against the other. Sometimes that sums up. And I think that in this particular case, that sums up. So if we invest on green technologies, we are going to facilitate the ultimately and maybe at medium term a better sovereignty of Europe also on this field, which for me is extremely important.
Thank you, Carmen. I'll go to the floor now for questions from the audience. So have we questions? You surely knew you were going to be asked a question, guys. Yes, indeed. And you might just introduce yourself as well when...
Yeah, thank you very much. Hannah Betsworth, APCO Worldwide. That was essentially what I was going to ask about, was how this forthcoming legislation, the Critical Medicines Act, the Biotech Act, will help create that atmosphere. What's the outlook for the next kind of 5 years in that regard?
Okay.
Well, maybe I can talk on the life science strategy, which is where we are now working on. Of course, I cannot say anything on the content because obviously it's on the making. But of course, this will be one of the main objectives of this strategy is to build a strong life science sector for Europe. So competitiveness, again, will be a critical key. But with no surprise, the convergence between biotech, between bioeconomy, between critical medicines are things that will be very much looked at it. It probably will be a kind of umbrella a strategy linking to others. But from the perspective of the critical medicines, again, this is not under the responsibility of my unit, but of course we will be closely associated. I just want to ensure that we will have enough research and innovation in there and that we will look more also to the medium and long term and not to the pure resolution of the problems of today, but to be seen.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, just a couple of things to mention. I mean, one thing obviously that we're keeping an eye on and looking forward to seeing is this clean industrial deal and how that might also link into greener supply chains as well. And we'd also obviously encourage any incentivization, for example, specifically in relation to more innovative antimicrobials because of the risks around antimicrobial resistance. And I think the threat there is only going to increase. We're somewhere around 35,000 deaths per year related to antimicrobial resistance. And obviously, if there's no incentivization, then we're not going to see any progress in that area. So I think for us, that's a critical area that we need to address. That's only going to increase in significance over the coming years.
Thank you very much, Ian. Just when you speak about critical medicines, critical ingredients, supply chains, or dependency in international trade, I can remember obviously two incidents, the the blockade of Suez Canal by a ship a number of years ago, it created a shortage of toilet paper in Europe. Essential, but not necessarily critical. But at the same time, it also showed how weak our supply chains are if there's an event. And then COVID came, and that really exposed our vulnerability to it. I was in this room some years ago, the kind invite of Dietrich and Ale again, just to discuss the Digital Operation Resilience Act. And I remember speaking to the industry. I was the rapporteur on this particular piece of legislation going through the Parliament. And I was obligating financial services to have, resilience, cyber resilience. And I spoke about the potential threats. And I spoke about North Korea, Iran, and Russia. And of course, this was pre-February 2022. And people probably thought I was a little extreme in terms of highlighting the geopolitical threats. And of course, Russia invaded Ukraine, and it showed how vulnerable we were to certain issues around cybersecurity, for example. It really exposed that. But it also exposed another thing, our vulnerability to geopolitical events in the area of energy. But you take that and you just magnify it to the pharmaceutical sector and that industry, how vulnerable we are potentially to geopolitical threats. So you take vaccines, for example, GSK, obviously one of the leaders in vaccines, but it did show our dependence on certain countries. Now, they are friendly countries, but in the event of they not being friendly or something happening that would cause a challenge, it really shows how vulnerable we are. So from that perspective, how do we improve our supply chains, but equally, how do we lessen our dependence on critical ingredients, critical raw materials, critical medicines, and sort of rehome in Europe a lot of those sectors without us obviously becoming closed to the outside world as well.
Thank you. I mean, part of it is around supply chain resilience. And actually, you talked about the energy security. And I love the statement that you can't turn off the sun. So actually going into renewable energy is actually a really positive way of building energy resilience in your supply chain as well. So there is a win-win on green renewable electricity as well as energy resilience as well. And the same with water. And I mentioned it before, but looking at how, and we've got commitments around how we look at water quality, water access, water use across not only our sites, but our supply chain. And how that really can impact supply chain resilience as well. So actually all of those projects and programs are supporting resilience of supply chain. So that's just on the energy and sort of the water side of things. And then when you look at geopolitical aspects, it sort of just amplifies even more. So it's then looking at, well, how can you optimize resources in those spaces? And I've come back to sort of innovation of technology, innovation of processes, looking at the ability to move goods around so you actually have got a sort of resilient supply chain infrastructure within a smaller space rather than having to fly it across the world. So there is opportunities to link that sustainability with innovation, with criticality of supply chain and medicines to de-risk some of the potential shocks that can come. I mean, one of the things we live in now is a world of the next shock. So I think this is the other thing we just need to be consciously aware of is how do we plan and prepare more sensibly? What is the incentives for that preparation as well? Because I think you mentioned about the antimicrobial resistance, which frankly terrifies me, and it should terrify everybody. So how are we really building the resilience into the healthcare systems for supporting novel antimicrobials? How are we actually reducing overuse, overconsumption of that? So it really is a pressing issue to look at. And then you've got the reduction of critical medicines. So I think they're all coming together. But I do think the planning and the incentivization and the support is critical to really drive that.
Yeah, just to add a couple of things. I think one of the things, and that was mentioned already, is this need to reduce waste and increase circularity as well, so that we are not dependent on the same quantities of raw materials that we're seeing in some of these supply chains as well. Because with the amount of waste you mentioned, 20% waste, we can't continue. That isn't sustainable in the longer run. And I think obviously there's benefits in terms of bringing some of those activities back into Europe as well. For example, if we're relying on for battery technology in terms of green energy, we're relying on metals, for example, that we're getting from areas where the environmental standards may not be the highest. So there's benefits to actually bringing some of those activities back into Europe as well, where we can do them more cleanly from that perspective. So I think it's not just about sort of doing things better, but actually doing less of some of these things and bringing in a more circular approach to the way we do these. What can we recover from some of the wastes that we're producing at the moment? I know in healthcare there's particular issues around reusing materials, but I think that we surely can find ways to overcome these issues as well.
Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Juan José Fernández Romero, and I work for a public affairs consultancy called Foretold. Now, my question is the following. You are very much talking about how sustainable policies go hand in hand with competitiveness within Europe. However, in your opinion, what should be done concretely to protect the competitiveness of European biotech companies in front of other companies from other regions of the world that may not have the same focus on sustainability at the moment, such as, for example, United States right now? Thank you.
Thanks very much, Juan. That's a good question. I don't know who to put it to first, but it's going to be require, I'd say, quite a detailed answer, because it is going to be a significant issue over the next number of years, and particularly, as I said, with the changing political views on the other side of the pond, as I say. I'll go to you, Claire, first. No, sorry, I'll go to.
Sorry, no, just I'm thinking, for example, there are many opportunities, I think, and what you are saying is critical. We need to support also the industry in order to be able to protect that and increase that productivity. In the case of the biotech sector, there are many small actors. I think that regulatory measures in order to facilitate their life could be certainly something needed, because the current situation of fragmentation, regulatory fragmentation in Europe is really unsustainable. So, but of course, I mean, we need member states for that as well. That's and we need obviously the willingness of really abandon some of the little kingdoms to say let's facilitate the red tape for everybody. I think that could help a lot, because even big companies are suffering from that, so small actors, which are extremely important in the field of biotech, would certainly benefit. This is something where there is going to be lots of actions. Think about how we can support small actors, also big actors, in order to protect and increase the competitiveness and the productivity. But I think the regulatory angle is an important one, and it's easy to say that from me. I'm working in research and innovation and not really in the regulation part, but I think this is something that is quite in the head of those who have put forward actions in these fields. Then there is the access to capital as well, which is quite important, and where we, capital market, capital union, all these kind of things should also be pushed forward. And yeah, Claire.
Thank you, Carmen. Claire.
You asked for a detailed answer, and I'm sure I'm still not going to get into the level of detail that you're looking for. But I think part of the answer to that is actually Europe does have an opportunity to accelerate and innovate and incubate. So how can you really give that support to biotech, whether it's small, medium, large organizations, to really accelerate innovation? How do you remove some of the regulatory blockers? And I'm not talking about diluting, trials and that process, but how can you accelerate or run in parallel some of those opportunities to really then unblock and bring that faster into the world, frankly, as well? But then how do you harmonize that with other regulators? So I'm particularly thinking about medical on this side. So, the FDA, the WHO, other medical regulators, how can Europe set the agenda to drive acceleration into those spaces and harmonization? Because one of the things I think that is causing those competitive challenges is you go, unfortunately, to the slowest moving part, which is not how we can accelerate. So how do you actually get the slowest moving part to be the fastest moving part? Harmonization of regulatory framework would be an amazing achievement, I think, frankly, on just a couple of topics that we're working on sustainability as well, but I'm sure on other areas too.
Yeah, I guess I need to be a bit careful, because the EEA is not, we're not so concerned about competitiveness, but I recognize that we can't expect companies to make huge investments in innovation if there's not some level of reward at the end of that process. So I think that's certainly important, and we've seen, I think I go back to procurement again, I think in terms of actually encouraging making sure that we're actually investing and buying from these companies that are procuring in this way. And for example, we have this new initiative around green claims, which makes sure that companies then, if they are making these claims around the greenness of their products, that it's been validated and legitimate. And I think that will help in terms of us actually understanding whether products and goods are actually green and how green they are from that perspective. And yes, and does it matter? Yes. So I think from our perspective, I think that's important because we want to see the innovation. So we need to make sure that the claims we make are valid from that perspective as well.
Thank you, Ian. Carmen?
Yeah, because there is also some element, very shortly, that you mentioned before on the clinical trials. And I think that's also an important element. We have to do something in order to ensure that Europe remains, an attractive place to run clinical trials. Because one thing is the biotech companies in Europe, but you need an ecosystem. So you need to have the large company, the small actors, the link with the academia, all that needs to work together. And clinical trials are an important element there. We know how the situation is getting very complicated in order to ensure that companies keep on doing clinical trials in Europe. For that, again, we need the member states. We need to ensure that we can do multi-country clinical trials to have some magnitude of figures. And that's one of the critical elements that we will be looking at as well in order to support the sector. And then the last, another thing which is related also to sustainability, because ultimately everything relates to sustainability if you look at the efficiency of what we are doing in general. And clinical research is a clear example. The years that last the preclinical and clinical trials and the failure, the little percentage of success in biotech is something that probably maybe it's not known by everybody. But if we really want to work on availability, access, reimbursement, innovation, we need to look at that as well. And I think the efficiency of clinical research can be improved by innovating as well. We can develop the preclinical models that would certainly allow for having, decided before a clinical trial whether you should run it or not. What would be the key for success? There are many things that you can do in order to try to increase that. That should be our main indicator, right? Let's increase the 7% of current success out of a clinical trial to, let's put a higher target. I think all that would increase ultimately the success of Europe as a place to do clinical trials. And I think there are many opportunities. We simply need to set up a space that, incentivates the uptake of those opportunities.
Thanks, Carmen. Dietrich, did you want to ask a question?
Maybe, if you don't mind, I want to follow up on that question, because you know how we all joked around saying that US invents, China copies, EU regulates. Used to be funny 10 years ago. Nobody laughs anymore at that joke. So we now have a concrete example, and I want to maybe take the debate. We have the industry saying that they worked very hard because this doesn't happen to release, what was it, 40 million of plastic, or how much was your example there when on the packaging? 40 tons? 4 tons. 400 tons. That was so that doesn't just happen. You worked very hard to get it, and at one point you're being asked to put it again. So let's take that example, which is not a success story. So what went wrong? Is it Commission regulating too much? Is it the Parliament adding when making legislation? Do we need to give executive orders to von der Leyen that power? Do we need to? Let's do a post-mortem of this particular case and see how we can solve those issues, because we want the industry to if there is good intent, how can they actually avoid those hurdles? So let's take that very concrete example, and so that is clearly for you as a question.
There you are, Claire.
What went wrong?
What went wrong? I think fundamentally what went wrong was two conflicting legislations hitting each other. And actually, when you're talking about release of medicines, the priority is getting the access for patients to release the medicines. So actually, the environmental directive around reducing the packaging size, removing the plastic, and the environmental objective we had to do that was frankly overtaken by, if we don't do what the EMA, the medical regulator is asking, we cannot get that product out to patients. So I think there is that conversation between how do we facilitate a conversation between two different groups and maybe not us, but like how do we, collective we, facilitate those conversations to actually say, this is causing that. And then if I jump onto, and if you were to add e-leaflets, it would have made life even easier, because the challenge was putting multiple languages on the packaging, for example, which made the packaging increase. So how about we transition very fast to e-leaflets, which actually removes all of those challenges and also reduces a lot of waste, because one of the challenges I think with e-leaflets is, or opportunities with e-leaflets, is you can update patient information faster, which means then that stock that is perfectly good medicines isn't being wasted as well. So I think there's a huge opportunity to tie a few together and say, I think there's an opportunity here if we just look at the different pieces together rather than in silos, would be one. Yeah, so this is a perfect example of starting the dialogue, but I want to continue that dialogue.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. But let's not start blaming each other. But yeah. But I think it's pretty obvious that across all of these areas that we need much more integrated solutions. That we can't just look at climate adaptation in isolation, or addressing biodiversity loss in isolation. That we need to look at solutions across the board, because we have targets, for example, under the Zero Pollution Action Plan to reduce plastic emissions, and then we see actions like this. So I think it's important that we have a bit more integrated thinking on how we can address these problems. And it is moving in that direction, but what I think we need to do more to encourage that. And I know, for example, that we in the EEA were working more closely with the Medicines Agency and with the other ENVI agencies under, we have a One Health task force that tries to look more broadly at how all of these different aspects come together, so that when we're thinking about, for example, how the environment, how animal health, how human health are all interlinked, and how the solutions that we can develop there can actually benefit all of them and avoid some of these tensions like that we're talking about at the moment.
Thanks very much, Ian. Yes. Question there. One question back there. Back to the...
Who was first?
Just back there to the man standing.
Thank you. So it's actually more response than the question to the question over there. So I am a sustainability manager at FPR, the trade association representing pharmaceutical industry. And what the reality is that when you put a new medicine on the market, you have a marketing authorization with precise chemicals and precise components. So everything is there. And if you want to change this formulation, if you want to have a new chemical, let's say, that is more sustainable, then you need a new marketing authorization. And this takes years. So what we really want to have more sustainable medicines, for instance, greener medicine, and to move faster with this is agile framework. We want the EMA and the regulators to be aware of this and to look at potential solutions that we put on the market to make sure that we don't wait 10 years to have greener medicine. And I think this is especially true for the legacy products, the generics that are very often more polluting than new product. So this is one of the contradiction, I think, that was in the discussion that we really need to look at, especially in the framework of the Critical Medicine Act, because most critical medicine are very polluting, and this is a contradiction that we have to solve if we want to be more independent, let's say.
Thank you very much. Question here as well. Just.
Thank you. Olivier Jankovic, I represent Valneva. We are developing and manufacturing vaccines, including some against vector-borne diseases or AMR. But I don't want to speak about the product, but more about the reporting. And the question is, we face quite a high challenge to comply with all the reporting guidelines that come on us, especially in Europe. And I think it's very important that we have documentation to show indeed and compare what we're doing and prove that we are complying with the different rules. We of course don't want to spend the time and lose the time reporting and rather innovate. So what can we do in Europe to improve and facilitate the reporting?
Thanks very much. Ian?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we're hearing more and more over the last number of months, is what can we do to reduce the reporting burden? So I think this is where things like digitalization come in as well, in terms of streamlining the way that reporting happens, because Well, for the EEA, we collect a lot of data, so this is something that we're very aware of. That it can place a burden on countries, and it can place a burden on business as well. But also the value and that we get from this in terms of highlighting where there's gaps in policy or where there's gaps in knowledge, I think is critical. So I think we need to be balanced in the approach that we take to doing this, and make sure that we're still getting the right level of evidence in order to support the policy decisions, or to see how we're progressing in terms of addressing some of these issues as well. So for us, it's something we're very aware of, but we're seeing how we can sort of strike that balance at the moment. And obviously, if a reporting requirement is set out in legislation, then it has to happen. So that this is not something that's going to happen overnight. We can do from our side, in terms of the data we collect, we can streamline the reporting mechanisms. But in terms of what people have to report, that's generally, if it's in legislation, then that requires a little bit more thinking in terms of amending the legislation from that perspective, for example.
I was just going to maybe go to a slightly different question as well, but very different, but then we can maybe round up because we're coming to an end of time. So there's one more here. So, okay, very quickly here. So.
Thanks. My name is Andrea Bonetti. I work for Chiesi. And I'd like to go back to the point of procurement because it has been mentioned several times. And especially when it comes to, let's say, sustainable products or innovative products, there is this element of rewarding actually the investment that has been done. And when we discuss also in countries, we have the comment that they don't feel the European rules are going far enough to allow them really to include these elements in their evaluations. So there is a lot of discussions around like demand for circular economy products also in the new mandate. And I was wondering what are then the concrete elements that could really boost and also at national level and allow for a more harmonized approach when it comes to procurement. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Claire. So just for the two questions, summarize as well, because we're coming to the end of our time, so we're finishing at some time. So,
thank you. I think you asked the question I was going to ask. So I would double click on that question. Actually, I think I totally support your question, which is actually how is the recognition of value of investment in changing products, particularly older products as well, but also supporting innovation in new products coming through. And I think there are opportunities to do that. So I think we do need to look at the procurement structure system, harmonization across countries, because there's no point in one country asking for a whole load of requirements in circularity, another country demanding low carbon footprint products. How are we harmonizing that and really driving after the right behaviors? And frankly, the answer, unfortunately, for sustainability is all of it. But how do we incentivize the right activities? And I think there needs to be recognition in healthcare system responses coming through from commercials. So I would probably support your question on that one. And in terms of summary, I do think there is a fantastic opportunity for Europe to lead on innovation, acceleration and incubation, but it really needs to grasp it now. I think the window to lead is shortening while there's some other political structures evolving. So I think there's a real opportunity to drive that acceleration. So what are the barriers that we can unblock, not to create unnecessary risk, but how do we de-risk some acceleration and innovation? And I think there's a real opportunity to do that now by connecting different departments and organizations to break down those silos to really get to, if this is happening, that's clearly not the objective we wanted. And reporting was mentioned a lot as well. So if that's causing pain rather than opportunity to drive value and see the benefit, what's going wrong with that, and how do we really turn that to, nobody just wants a pretty report at the end of the day. So what are you actually driving reporting for, and have we got the right mechanisms to deliver that? So I think there's a real opportunity now to grasp some of that sort of uncertainty maybe in political structures to really galvanize the different groups across Europe. And I think part of this would be, we want to continue this discussion and dialogue, but fast, so that we can really get to some of those actions.
Yeah, just to summarize from our perspective, I think it's obvious that the crisis that we're dealing with now, for example, climate change and the pollution and biodiversity loss are actually driving an increasing demand for healthcare. And this, I'd push again, this preventive element, that by protecting the environment, but by increasing biodiversity, by being more resilient in terms of climate, that we can actually reduce the demand for healthcare in the first place, and that will push us a long way towards being more sustainable. I would also say it's really important. People listen to people in the healthcare sector. The citizens listen, and they need to also be advocates for a cleaner environment, for taking action against in relation to climate as well. People listen to their doctors, for example. Well, I know from an Irish perspective anyway. So I think it's so I'd really push that preventive element, because I think it can go a long way towards actually kickstarting that move towards a much more sustainable healthcare system.
Thank you, Ian. Carmen?
Thank you. So, yeah, many things have said, and I agree with very much with what you said. First of all, it's very good that we are talking about this. So 5 years ago, sustainability, this sector was not very much in the loop. I think it started by that time. So things are changing. There are a lot of already good things happening in several countries, even in procurement and, some criteria. And I think that in order to ensure that things will ultimately change, we need to ensure that we are not only looking at the sustainability, even if we should, for all the reasons that Jan was mentioning, because investing in sustainability is going to bring us better health outcomes, which ultimately is the most important thing. But I think we should do it by also tackling the big issues that are affecting our healthcare sector, our healthcare systems now, because there are, AMR is one, clearly, but let's look also at the fact of how the population is aging. Adverse drug reactions are really a very big worrying problem now. So we have to look at this by increasing, as you are saying, the prevention, but looking how innovation can be put at the service of the huge challenges that our healthcare systems are going to face in the future. Let's not forget that financial sustainability is really put into question. So this should not be overlooked. For me, this is a very, very important element. And I would like to bring the point to the regulatory issues and to the regulatory preparedness. What I don't remember his name, but this man who asked a question coming from FPA about the time that it takes. I think he had to leave, but I think that's extremely important. We need to ensure that our regulators are ready in order to be able to approve the innovations that will come in the future. Otherwise, we are investing and for nothing. So that's an important point. They need to have the good resources. They need to have the good capacities in terms of skills to look at all those things. And that's very complicated. It's already complicated for innovations that have nothing to do with green. So can you imagine when you bring together, because we are talking about interdisciplinarity, it's quite complicated. So it's good that there is the willingness, the political willingness to tackle this issue, but we need to prepare for it. And this is also about the skills, capacities. So it's important to keep this dialogue, and I think it's important to ensure that we just not keep it to the pure sustainability and pure green, because many other issues are in the same spectrum.
Muchas gracias, Carmen. Thank you very much. My multilingual skills coming to the fore. Just to thank each and everyone for participating today, the speakers, Claire, Carmen and Ian. And I suppose in summing up, I mean, if you look back over the evolution of humanity itself, I mean, the last 100 years, probably the greatest achievements we had in terms of public health and longevity and life expectancy has been in the area of clean water, wastewater disposal, clean air in most modern urban living times, and vaccines and dietary requirements. Primarily, they're all in the areas preventative. So, I mean, if we continue to regulate in the area of preventative, in other words, making sure we've clean water, clean air, in the area of diet as well, in the preventative areas, it is a big part of the overall sustainability picture. And that is something we should never lose sight of, is the idea of preventative. Of course, there is incentivization and encouragement requirements to do that, because very often it's the downstream treatments is the area where industry benefits most. But we do have to incentivize in the key areas of prevention. And that's why I'm not saying that because GSK are here, but the areas of vaccines, for example. And I suppose no debate will be concluded without discussing misinformation and disinformation, and the areas of where we really have to in public health policy, for example, descale the myths around vaccines and prevention. And it's an area that we have to do an awful lot of work. And you can see that in the most recent times regarding COVID and vaccination programs, where there was a lot of misinformation, disinformation, intentional and unintentional across social media and seeping out more broadly in the whole area. And that is something that regulators, policymakers, and industry and the clinical element as well will have to deal with. Because if we are to, I'm going to a debate later on in the whole area of cervical cancer, HPV vaccines. We had to run a massive campaign in Ireland to encourage the uptake of HPV vaccine again, because there was a downward spiral. It went below 50% at one stage, where we know it prevents cancer. We know that. And yet there was a huge campaign of misinformation, disinformation, and it really shattered the confidence in this particular public health vaccination program, to the point where we had to reactivate and go out and re-educate the public on its benefits. So it's just an area I think that we all have to be conscious of. So look, from my perspective, over the next number of months, we have a number of things to do in the Parliament, and that's the whole area of the pharmaceutical strategy itself. We have to get it right in terms of that balance, and Carmen referenced the ecosystem. We have to have an ecosystem. Of course, the ecosystem in terms of innovation research doesn't start in GSK and Carritool in Cork in Ireland. It starts in our schools. It starts in our secondary schools, in our universities, encouraging that inquisitive mind and facilitating that inquisitive mind, and then linking academia with industry, and then making sure that the regulation that sits on top of that encourages, but yet ensures that there is no harm done in terms of advancing the whole area of research and innovation. So stakeholder engagement, in my view, is of huge importance in terms of the regulatory aspect of what we're doing here in Europe. And that's why I think over the next number of years, you can sense now the Commission's view. Ursula von der Leyen, when she outlined her vision for the next 5 years in her speech on take up the presidency, the Draghi report, they all highlight the need to have regulation. Regulation is good. Good regulation is good. And what we need to do now is to ensure that when it comes out for public discussion, that there's broad stakeholder engagement right across, and then that when it goes through the political process, it comes out doing what it's meant to do, which is to regulate in a way that benefits industry, citizens, the consumer, but that it does it in a way that doesn't harm Europe's competitiveness. And we have to get that balance right. And I think to date, people can have criticisms about the Green Deal, the digital economy, that major rush 5 years ago when the previous commission was formed. But I think it was ambitious, and it set a very high bar. What we need to do now is ensure that the high bar of ambition we set doesn't have a negative impact on our competitiveness, that we actually use those high bars to raise our competitiveness. And that's why it goes back to the original opening in terms of where we are in Europe. Europe is a leader. And as Dietrich outlined, the joke previously, innovation, producing and regulation. But I still believe that if we regulate in a way that's clever, that's, takes into account the whole ecosystem, that Europe can play a very key role in the years ahead and be the benchmark for regulatory impact across the globe. Of course, geopolitically, that is going to be a significant challenge because of our multi-polar sort of developing world as it is. Previously, it was Europe and the US. We now have it's multipolarized, so we have to be conscious of that and understand that is happening as well, and to embrace it in a way to ensure that Europe is at the heart of competitiveness and is at the heart of being that key global player, both in terms of regulation, but also in terms of innovation, and get that balance right. So look, I do want to thank Claire, Ian and Carmen. I want to thank Dietrich and Alde for facilitating this. Stakeholder engagement is hugely important, and I'm not making a political speech here because I'm in Alde headquarters, but stakeholder engagement includes political groupings as well, because they do reflect a view out there among citizens and society, and it's reflected regularly in the ballot boxes across Europe. So political engagement is a good thing for everybody concerned. So to thank Alde, to thank all of you for participating, and our speakers, and to wish you well in the time ahead. Thank you.